Hello and welcome to this presentation. Also, thank you for the conference organizers for having me here. I'm Lasse van den Dickenberg. I'm a PhD student at Leiden University. And today I'm going to talk about the grinding and polishing experiments which I've done. I'm going to link that to archaeological observations from my studies on flint axes and flint axe fragments from the Vlaardingen culture. My research is part of a larger research project, the Putting Life into Late Neolithic Houses project. This is what I will briefly introduce. After that, I will talk briefly about the Vlaardingen culture, so it's the archaeological context for this study. I will discuss some of the previous studies and experiments which have been done relating to the grinding and polishing of flint. I will discuss the methods I've used, and I will discuss the results of my experiments. And lastly, I will link this also to the archaeological results from my studies. My research is part of the Putting Life into Late Neolithic Houses project. It's a project by Leiden University and also from several other public partners. The incentive for this project was that with the university we reconstructed this beautiful Vlaardingen culture house, which you can see here. This house has been completely built with Stone Age tools and Stone Age technology. And after we finished that project, we realized that we didn't really know how to furnish this house. So we had a nice empty house, but we didn't know what to put in there. And that made us realize we also didn't know that much about crafts in this period or subsistence strategies. So with the project, we hope to reconstruct in more detail what daily life looked like in this period. A big role in this project is also dedicated to experimental archaeology, which we use to create, for example, a reference collection for microwear analysis. And in the case I'm presenting today, also to create a reference collection for production traces on flint. Now, my role in the project is that I study the flint, so both the archaeological flint and the experimental flint. And that's, of course, what I'm talking about today. Now, the archaeological context for this study is the Vlaardingen culture. This is a Neolithic culture in the Western Netherlands, so in the wetland area. And it's important to note that in this area there's no local flint available. So all the flint had to be imported from other regions. Now, the closest flint sources are located in Utrecht, in the center of the Netherlands, the modern day Netherlands. So it's about 70 kilometers away from these wetland sites. We see that often people went even further to import their flint. They often went to the flint mines in Belgium, in Hesbaye or Spienne, or Rijkold in Limburg. And these sites are located even 200 kilometers away from these wetland sites. So we see there's a lot of long distance interaction. What we also see is that often people imported finished axes from those areas, and that they reused them here as flake cores. So often you don't find complete axes. So a lot of the study material is actually axe fragments or axe flakes. And I put a nice example of that here in the picture. So you see a scraper-borer combination. But as you can see that on the top right of the object, you still see this ground surface. And that indicates this object is actually made from a reused flint axe. So because there are not that many complete axes, I mainly study the production trace on these kind of fragments. Now, the axes I'm talking about, they're called Buren axes. These are oval flint axes, which are generally completely ground or polished. They're mainly made in Hesbaye in Belgium. We know that these axes are flaked near the flint mines there. And then they were exported to nearby villages where they were ground. And after that, they were imported to these Vlaardingen culture sites in a finished state. So we know that these people didn't make these axes themselves. They always imported them as complete objects. And that's important for this study as well to note. The incentive for my study it came when I was studying these axe fragments from several Vlaardingen culture sites. And there I began to notice that these axe fragments on these different sites, they looked slightly differently. When I was looking at the axe fragments from Hekelingen and Vlaardingen, I saw they were generally quite shiny, and to me it seemed like they were nicely polished. But the axe fragments from the sites in De Heek, from Den Haag Steinhof and Den Haag Wateringse Binnentuinen, they were generally not shiny, and so to me it looked like they were not polished. So that was basically the hypothesis from which I'm starting. So I think that there's a difference in production traces which I can observe between these different Vlaardingen culture sites. Now, to test this hypothesis, I initially looked up literature on grinding experiments and polishing experiments, but I quickly found out that there wasn't that much done on this topic. There were some grinding experiments, but those were generally focused on the duration of the grinding process. So people were mainly replicating ground X's to see how long it takes to grind a flint X. For the polishing trace, I could only find one experiment, but it wasn't also really properly published. It's an experiment where Van Gijn and Wentic polished flint using sand and leather. And this experiment is actually located in the reference collection at Leiden University. So for my study, I could look at this experiment. Now for the methodology, because there weren't that many experiments in the literature, I decided to set up my own reference collection with production traces. For that I used experimental archaeology to replicate these traces. And I studied the traces using a metallographic microscope. Because I thought it would give more details, I would study the production trace with a microscope instead of just looking at them without microscopes. Now for the reference collection, I did different experiments. I did different grinding experiments using different types of grinding stones. I used two types of sandstone, so those were representative of hard grinding stones. And I used a piece of slate, which I used as a representative of very soft grinding stone. I also did experiments where I ground the flint using sand as an additive. And lastly, I did polishing experiments where I polished the flint using different types of additives and leather. So now I'm going to present the results of all these experiments, and I'm going to do that with microscope photos. Now I can imagine that not all of you are familiar with what flint looks like under a microscope. So for reference, in the top left, I put a picture of what flint looks like if it's not ground or polished. So this is what flint looks like under a microscope when it's freshly knapped. Now in these other three pictures, you can see the experiments I did with grinding the flint on sandstones. As you can see on the two right pictures, you can see that if you grind flint on a sandstone, there's polish developing, but there's mainly also a lot of very deep scratches, very broad scratches, which are developing when you're grinding it. In the bottom left picture, you see a picture where I ground flint on sandstone and where I included sand in the grinding process. What you see there is that the polish which develops is more rough than in these other pictures, and there's also more polish. And this polish also has a lot of very fine scratches, which you don't really see in these other grinding experiments. So I think that's really indicative of sand being included in the grinding process. For this, I have to say that I don't know if this is really archaeologically that relevant, because I can imagine that if you would grind flint on a sandstone for a long period of time, the sandstone particles will become detached and they will also start acting as sand in the grinding process. So I can imagine that even if you don't add sand intentionally to the grinding process, you can still get these kind of traces if you grind long enough. In these pictures, I present the results of my polishing experiments. As you can see, I also put in the top left a picture of the grinding experiments on slate. And I did that because when I was doing this experiment, I noticed that the flint became very nicely polished when you would grind it on slate. And it takes quite a lot of time to grind flint on a soft stone like this. So I don't really think that they would use these kind of soft stones as actual grinding stones, but I can imagine that they would use them for polishing. As I said, because you get a nicely polished surface. Now under the microscope, you can see that this polish is quite rough and there's a lot of very fine scratches. And that's different from the experiments where I polished the flint with sand and leather, because then you get a very smooth polish. And if you polish long enough, it completely removes the grinding traces and you just get a very smoothly polished surface. And the picture on the bottom right, you can see the experiment by Wentic and Van Gijn. What they did, they didn't grind the flint before they started polishing it. So this is what it looks like if you only polish the flint with sand and leather. And these kind of traces we could occasionally observe archaeologically as well. Because if you would grind these X's, the grinding stone doesn't reach into the deeper parts of these X's, so it only reaches the high parts. And these deeper flake negatives, they're not ground. But if you would then polish the X, the leather follows the shape of the X, so it also reaches into these deeper flake negatives. So that's where you often observe these kind of polishes. I expanded my polishing experiments also by using different types of additives. So I also used charcoal and ashes in addition to sand. But as you can see here in the pictures, there's not really a difference between the use of different types of additives. In all cases, this very smooth polish develops, and it generally removes the grinding trace if you polish long enough. So I don't think I can archaeologically really distinguish between these types of additives. So when I see these kind of traces on archaeological X fragments, I just say this flint was polished using leather with additives. But I don't interpret the type of additive. I have to say that I think it's most likely that they used sand for this, because the polishing with sand went much faster than with these other types of additives. And since even on a microscopic scale it has the same effect, I don't think they would prefer to use something else if it takes more time. Now, moving on to the archaeological results. As you can see in this graph, generally my hypothesis was confirmed. So in the area of the Hague, so in Steinhof and Wateringse Binnentuinen, most of the X fragments were only ground and only a few of them were actually polished. In Hekelingen and Vlaardingen, but especially in Hekelingen, a large part of these X fragments was actually polished with leather and additives. What I could also nicely observe was that on some of these X fragments I could see multiple types of production traces on one fragment, so I call that multiple facets. And sometimes this was related to resharpening or reshaping of the X's. So in these cases I could often observe this polish from leather and polishing with leather and additives in the deeper flake negatives on the X fragments, but on the higher parts I could only see grinding traces. And this indicated originally the X's were completely polished, but then the X's were resharpened or reshaped on a grinding stone, which largely removed the polishing traces. But because the grinding stones don't reach into these deeper parts, the polishing traces were still preserved there. So that was a nice indication for the resharpening and also the use life of these X's. Even though my hypothesis was generally confirmed, it didn't really solve the problem. Because I still don't really have a suitable explanation for this difference. The sites I studied, these 4 sites, they're all contemporary. And I know that for all the flint comes from the same areas in Belgium and Limburg. And we know that these X's were produced near the flint mines and not in these Vlaardingen culture settlements. So based on those premises, these X's should have been produced the same way, but they're clearly not. So I'm still struggling with the question why there's a difference. It could be that there's a local preference, so that in Hekelingen and Vlaardingen they prefer to import nicely polished X's, but that in the region of the Hague they mainly import ground X's. Another explanation could be that they always imported ground X's, but that they would polish them in this region on these Vlaardingen culture settlements. I think there's more hypotheses you can formulate, but I'm still not really sure what's the most suitable explanation. So also if you have suggestions for me how to interpret this, please let me know. I'm going to continue to find a suitable explanation for the differences which I've observed. And I intend to also study more production traces on more Vlaardingen culture sites. And also if I find new types of traces on the archaeological fragments, I will also try to do more experiments to also match those traces to specific production procedures. Well, thank you for listening to this talk. And thank you for having me to the conference organizers. As I said, if you have any suggestions for me how to interpret these differences between these sites, feel free to email me. I put my email address here. Thank you. This was it.